the Bible is the truth, because the Bible shows us how we can live in a life of peace and love and joy together. Now you might ask me, well, don't lots of religions in the world show us how we can live in peace and joy and love? And to that I will say, yes. Many religions do show us with examples, morals and characters, such as the story of Buddha. They show us how we can live loving lives to a degree. Some succeed more than others, but the Bible shows us more examples of how we can live in love. It gives us more moral decrees. It gives us a greater detail, more advice for how we can actually live in loving kindness. But more than that, it shows us more examples and more characters which actually show us how we can live in love and kindness in the real world. The Bible is all about a real life application of these transcendental life lessons. For example, Jesus says, love thy neighbor as thyself. But he doesn't just tell us to love our neighbor as ourselves, he also shows us. But it doesn't just stop there. It isn't just Jesus who shows us through his life. It's so many characters in the Bible, spanning 4,000 years of history, 4,000 years of continents and cultures and peoples and problems and all kinds of situations in life. The Bible deals with it. So we can say that the Bible is the source and the summit of the truth, because the Bible, it makes its number one endeavor, its number one goal to research and define and to test and to show us and reveal to us how we can actually live in loving kindness. And that is why the Bible is the source and summit of the truth, because it's the compendium, it's the exhaustive account for how we can actually live and love together. Now, you might say to me, well, what about the handful of verses, or what about those verses in the Bible, the hard sayings where, critics accuse God of doing evil? Now, I want to say to you that that is not true. Let's give an example here. Imagine someone set out to study the nature of a mountain, and they went to the foot of the mountain and they took a handful of material from the bottom of the mountain, maybe some pebbles or rocks, and they took it back to the lab. Now, people have claimed that the mountain is made of granite, but this person goes to the lab with this tiny sample and he makes a conclusion about the mountain based on that tiny sample from the mountain. And he says, no, those people were wrong. I disagree. See, the problem with that person is that they didn't do a fair test or a fair analysis of the mountain. They took a small amount of verses, took it back to the lab, and they made a wrong conclusion, in this case, in the case of the Bible. Because what they did was people have taken a handful, maybe 20 to 100, a handful of hard sayings, and they have then given those sayings veto power. That means that they have given those sayings interpretive power. Oh, because this place in the Bible says that God does evil, that means that all the thousands of verses in the Bible where it says that God cannot lie, God cannot do evil, God cannot see evil, God is light, and in him is no darkness at all, he is love. All those verses, they say, are uprooted and made into contradictions, and they are made dubious and spurious, and they are made untrustworthy because of this handful of verses in the Bible. Now, that is numerically unfair, and it is a skewed way to study the nature of a mountain. You don't know the nature of the mountain from just a handful of pebbles at the foot of the mountain. You need to do a complete test. So what we find then, doing this complete test, is thousands and thousands of verses which tell us plainly that no, God condemns slavery. He abolishes slavery. He condemns all kinds of crimes. He condemns murder. He condemns lying. He condemns stealing. He condemns all evil. He cannot even look upon evil. There's no darkness in him at all. The Bible also tells us that God cannot lie. God cannot contradict. He cannot go back on his word. Okay? And so there is no doubt at all that the Bible, the whole Bible, is telling us that God is love and he cannot do evil. So when it comes to these hard sayings, this handful of hard sayings out of 30,000 verses in the whole Bible, what we find is that the Bible is telling us that those verses cannot mean or say what critics tell you that they say. Here's one example. A verse in the Bible might say that, according to critics, that God commands or institutes slavery, and that he endorses slavery. Now they have a handful of verses for this claim, but if we look to the whole of the Bible, we see no. God tells us directly, do not oppress the foreigner, do not oppress your neighbors, love your neighbor as yourself. There are thousands of these verses. So the Bible itself tells us, no, you have interpreted those few verses that you criticize wrongly. Because I say that I could never do that. I say that I am pure love. So do not judge me based on this minority of misunderstood verses. Instead, judge me based on what I say in the whole Bible. And that is numerically fair. But to judge God and to judge his message based on a few verses in the Bible is factually the very definition of being biased. Because to be biased is to look at a subject and only look at a part of the subject that you want to look at, and to bring out your conclusion from a small part of the subject, but not giving a chance for the whole of the subject to have a say. So this is what these critics do, is they make a skewed conclusion. Now, am I saying that the Bible contradicts that? Well, because the majority of the Bible says God cannot do evil, that the minority verses which critics say he does do evil are contradictory, and that we should just side with the majority and kick out the minority? No. What I'm saying is that the majority of the Bible is telling you and me to interpret those minority hard sayings differently. Because right now what people are doing is they are using the minority verses to interpret the majority of the verses. Because God says he condones slavery in the Old Testament, well, that means God is loving in all these thousands of other verses in a way that we don't understand, or in a way that is too high for us to understand. For God, it's okay for him to command slavery, right? That's what they say, because they're allowing this minority of verses to have veto interpretive power over the majority. But it is numerically skewed, it's unfair, it's biased. What they should do instead is let the majority of the verses tell them that the minority cannot mean what they think it means. That no, God is love and would never do evil. So that is why the Bible is the truth. That is why you can trust the Bible. And that is why you do not need to fear these critics who accuse God. Read the Bible yourself. Look especially in the Old Testament, there's so many verses about God's love, how he never wants evil, he never does evil, he is pure, perfect. The New Testament says that God is not a liar. It's impossible for him to lie or to go back on his goodness and his love. So believe in what the Bible says, not in what men say the Bible says, based on the minority of misunderstood verses. So that is why the Bible is the truth.